Hey guys, Guru here today. We are doing a tier ranking for the evil heroes in Lord of the Rings: The Third Age, the Game Boy Advance version. So, if you want a breakdown of what the different categories mean, I'll refer you to my first tier ranking video. So, if you have any questions, you can check that out or comment below. So, anyway, just a quick summary of each of these heroes. Starting with Grishnakh, he's kind of an interesting mixed bag. He's quite mobile, moving 4 tiles per turn. He starts out with really average damage, not that great, but with some upgrades, it actually gets to be pretty solid. He has the shock effect, so he's more likely to cause enemies to flee, which is handy. And he actually carries the berserker. He actually carries 2 berserker root items, which can let him spread out some damage fairly well, and can also potentially let him cause multiple enemies to flee in one turn. But I will note that's not super likely, but it can happen. He starts out pretty average when it comes to toughness, not that great, but with a few upgrades, and also his take cover skill, which uh, lets the whole flank tank reduce damage from ranged attacks for a turn. So with those things combined, he ends up with actually decent survivability as well as his mobility, but his survivability starts out very average or below average. But his weakness and also his take cover ability is very useful. He's the only one of these heroes who has that ability. There are some levels where you get sort of a generic hero who has a weak version of take cover, but that is significant since that can really help when you're dealing with enemies like Legolas or Athelian Rangers who can really thin out your ranks otherwise. And yeah, that's his strengths, but his weaknesses are his spirit points are pretty bad. They're not awful, but they're definitely poor. His morale is awful at cowardly. So anytime he gets hit, there's a pretty decent chance that he's going to flee, which, funnily enough, actually does in some way almost boost his survivability. Because if he gets hit with his mobility, he's just going to get out of there. Whereas a unit with or a hero with better morale might stay around and get taken out. So that's kind of an interesting thing, but it is overall, I'd say, probably a downside that his morale is so bad. And also his leadership is just really average. And so moving on, Lurtz. Lurtz has decent spirit points. He ends up with quite good spirit points once he gets an upgrade. Lurtz has good damage, and it gets better with an upgrade. Lurtz starts out with, good range, but with an upgrade, he ends up having the highest range of any of these heroes, which is nice. He doesn't have the sharpshooter effect, so he can't fully enjoy that longer range like a hero like Faramir or Legolas could, so that is worth noting. However, he has high enough damage that it is still nice to be able to attack from 5 tiles away. And his morale is, it's very good. It's brave, which is quite good. And he has the flurry effect, so he can spread out his damage, which can be quite nice. But his weaknesses are he starts with mediocre hit points at only 20. He also just has overall mediocre leadership at 0 to 3. He does carry a Spoils of War for one-time use to give 1 leadership point, so that's nice. But overall, he's still a pretty average leader. And also, he's actually just extremely expensive to fully upgrade. His 3 sort of equipment upgrades cost a total of 135 XP, which is more than any of these other heroes. So Lurtz, he's a real investment. That is worth noting. He's a serious investment. Moving on to Ugluk, who is like Grishnakh, quite a mixed bag. Ugluk, he's a tank. He's got 25 hit points. It's excellent. Fully upgraded. He has 30 hit points, the best of any of these heroes. I want to say second only to the Witch King. He has very good spirit points. They don't upgrade, but it's at 11, which is still very good. And it's actually quite nice that you don't have to upgrade them. So his spirit points consistently very good. He his damage is excellent. He starts out with the highest base damage, and he still ends with the highest just base damage. He doesn't have too many ways to really like spike his damage, but it's just consistently very high, very good. He lands big hits. You'll definitely notice when you're using him that he's landing big hits. His morale is great. It's brave. He's not going to flee much. And he has a very good flank effect on your feet, which restores some hit points to the entire flank. Coupled with his solid spirit points, he can really help the entire flank stay alive, including himself. So he can really put that to good use, and especially keep himself alive, keep himself in the fight, which is very good. And also, he's actually pretty cheap to upgrade. His sort of item or his sort of basic upgrades cost a total of 60 XP, second cheapest of all these heroes, so that's quite valuable. But his weaknesses, he doesn't have a ranged attack, so he's going to be in melee, which he's very good at melee, but it is always nice to have a ranged attack, especially when you have average movement, which he does. And really the biggest downside is just his leadership. He has the worst leadership in the game, just generic spirit points, 0 to 2. It's the same amount of leadership as like Merry and Pippin have. It's truly terrible leadership. So you can't really he's really hard to use by himself because that's like a third. I don't know exactly how the math works out with the game, but I assume that's like a third of the time. He just doesn't have any leadership points, so if he's the only hero on the board, he just can't really do anything, or he's just very limited. So, so his leadership points, that's his big weakness. And moving on, Gothmog. Gothmog has excellent spirit points. He starts out with 10, which is good, but he fully upgrades to have 13, which is the absolute best of any of these heroes. So Gothmog definitely ends up with excellent spirit points. Gothmog, his damage starts out average, decent. It ends up fairly good at a respectable 7. Seven's decent. It's good. He he has good leadership. He starts out with of these heroes, he starts out with sort of the second best leadership. The best starting leadership is definitely Wormtongue. However, Gothmog carries Spoils of War for that one-time leadership point, and he also has the Intimidate skill, which he can use to generate leadership points. So he doesn't necessarily start out the best leader, but with some investment, well, a decent amount of investment because it's an expensive skill, he definitely ends up the best leader or most likely. So it's definitely an investment, but he definitely gets there eventually, and that's very valuable. He also, once upgraded, gets the shock ability, which is helpful. It's helpful to be able to have a higher chance to cause enemies to flee. That's just useful. His weaknesses, his hit points are just poor. He starts out with 18 hit points, sort of the third lowest of these guys, and really not enough for a slow or an average for a hero that is average mobility and doesn't have a ranged attack. So his hit points are a serious problem for him, as well as his lack of a ranged attack, and also his morale's kind of average. So he can't really be. He's not a consistently good frontliner, but he does end up being a very good leader. So moving on, Gorbag, good mobility. Gorbag ends up with very good damage. Not the absolute best damage, but very solid. On par with Lurtz. Not quite on par with Ugluk, but definitely near there. Gorbag ends up being a very good damage dealer. And he has the Rage ability, and he carries the Shelob poison. So Gorbag can really spike his damage, which is definitely something. Which is especially nice since Gorbag has a ranged attack. It's nothing insane, but it is helpful to be able to spike that damage from a distance, keep himself safe. His morale is great. His upgrades are actually super cheap at only 40 XP to get the 3 kind of basic upgrades. So that is really nice. You don't have to invest in him. Perhaps it's not even advisable to invest him in early, but if you're kind of towards the end of the game and you're running low on heroes, and you just have a few big battles left, and you just want a decent guy to put in at the last minute, because his upgrades are so cheap, you can put him in one big battle, and he's good to go. 1 or 2 big battles. So those cheap upgrades, that's definitely valuable. That's definitely not worth ignoring. However, his weaknesses, his hit points are bad. He has the second lowest hit points, and his hit points are just a real serious weakness. Like he's very frail, especially for being a big damage dealer, someone who's best in melee but also quite good at range. It's just tricky since his hit points really don't support what he tries to do. And his spirit points aren't great. He uses rage, which is pretty cheap, so he doesn't need to have amazing spirit points, but it really doesn't help the entire team to have a hero with such uh, poor spirit points, so that is a real downside. And also, his leadership is pretty average, 0 to 3. It's not amazing. It's not awful. It's very average, or even a little below average, because he doesn't carry spoils of war. So, Sharku, the next one to talk about. Sharku has very good hit points. He doesn't end up with as many hit points as Ugluk does. Sharku caps at 27, whereas Ugluk caps at 30. However, I will note that Sharku gets the Mordor Cloak item, or upgrade, which reduces all damage he takes by -1. I can't entirely say whether +3 hit points is more powerful or more helpful or less helpful than a -1 damage penalty. I assume -1 damage penalty over time would be more valuable. However, Ugluk can also heal himself, so I think in terms of overall durability, well, I would say Ugluk, but Sharku also double moves, and he has the Strength of Mordor ability, which can cause enemies to automatically flee when he hits them for that one turn. So I can't really conclusively say, but I'll just say that Sharku very has several ways to keep himself alive, and one of those is definitely his solid hit points and his damage reduction. So will definitely stay in the fight for a while. He's not squishy at all. And like I said, he double moves because he's mounted, so his mobility is good. He can get where he needs to, and he also has a ranged attack, which also helps that mobility. He has a good fear effect. He has the shock effect, being because he's mounted, but he also has the strength of Mordor ability for when. I guess what I'd say is if you don't need to cause an enemy to flee, you can just attack normally. But if you really need them to flee and you want that guarantee, I'd say that's the time to use Strength of Mordor, which is actually a really cheap skill. So it's definitely something you can use a decent amount. But his leadership starts out pretty average, not really that special. But with investment into an upgrade, he actually ends up with decent leadership. He carries the Spoils of War item, which is quite helpful. And his one of his upgrades, Orthanc Whip, makes it so he doesn't get the disorder effect. Which, if you've played the game or watched my videos, you'll notice at the start of every turn there's an effect. It's like free move. Normally it's free move, but sometimes it's onslaught, rally. Disorder is one where you just lose all spirit points in that flank, and it's a real pain. Sharku, once upgraded, he just negates that. It doesn't happen for you. I can't really quantify how impactful that is because it's an effect you're not noticing. So there's not really a way to say how big of a deal it is, but it's definitely helpful. So I would say Sharku ends up being a decent leader. Not an amazing leader, but a decent leader. But his weaknesses, he has the absolute worst spirit points of any hero at a piddly 5. It's bad. That is offset by Strength of Mordor being a super cheap skill to use, but still, his spirit points are terrible. And also his morale, it's not awful, but it's not good. It's average. So his morale definitely is a hindrance. And also his damage just isn't that high. He has a base damage of 5, and with an upgrade he does 6 damage in melee. However, because he's a double moving uh, hero who also has a bow, often you're not going to want to use him in melee. Often he's going to be a bit more valuable attacking from range, so you're not going to benefit from that damage boost. So I would say his damage is kind of a weakness of his because it's not awful, but it's not that great. So moving on to Wormtongue. Wormtongue is definitely the hardest to quantify, the most I guess imbalanced in the sense that in some ways he's awesome and in some ways he's awful. So I'll just go through it. Wormtongue, he has 9 hit points, which is just awful, truly awful. However, there are some good points to go with it. So Wormtongue, he has great spirit points. He ties with Lurtz for having the second. Well, he ties with Lurtz and Ugluk for having the second highest spirit points of these heroes once he's fully upgraded. which is a knock because he has to get that upgrade to be there. But still, his spirit points are good. He has good spirit points. He has a movement of 4, so his mobility is good. He uh he can actually do a high amount of damage, sort of initial one-time burst damage. He can buy the vial of poison upgrade, which one time per level, only once. He can really the first time he attacks on any given level, he does an additional 5 damage, and he also carries 2 held items that boost damage and a Saruman shield of poison, which those together add +3. So with his base damage of 3, he can have a maximum of 11 bonus damage. Actually, no, sorry, a base damage of 8 bonus damage to that 11. So for at least for one attack in the game, he can do 11 damage, which obviously that's a lot of damage, but that is only once. So in the right moment, that could be big. And really, and he has a morale effect, Curse of Orthanc. I don't think it's an amazing skill. I think it's actually kind of mid. I don't think it's that great. However, it is there if you want to. So he can penalize an enemy hero, or really any unit, but probably a hero with decreased morale and also decreased damage dealing. So, and he can also get the Mordor cloak, and he also regenerates. So he has some ways to buff his survivability, some unconventional ways. So he's not necessarily helpless despite his 9 hit points. And his most powerful thing, I would say, is just his leadership. He has 2 to 3 leadership points, so he starts out the best leader, funnily enough, because I mean he's really is just this weird greasy guy, but he starts out as the absolute best leader. With enough investment, I would say that Gothmog eventually surpasses him, but I think it does take a while because 2 to 3 leadership points is just so good. So yeah, his leadership is excellent. It's really good. But his weaknesses, like I said, 9 hit points. He does offset that in some ways, but you can't get around how bad 9 hit points is. Aragorn, using the Arms Mastery skill to buff his damage, can one shot him, and Ent could easily one shot him, though it'd probably have to be kind of close. Which most of the time you just keep Wormtongue in the back, the far back, and you keep him out of the fight. On some maps you can afford, like you have room to keep him in the back and out of the fight, and it's not a problem. Like the Breach of Helm's Deep or whichever one that is. That one you can keep him in the back behind the walls. I mean, it's just not a problem. But there are other maps where the map is too constricted for him to just hide away. And if you're doing an Iron Man run, like I've been doing, I would say that you can't use Wormtongue on a lot of maps because he's so frail. It's most likely that he's going to get caught up either by archers, Legolas especially, or just you know riders or just enemy units in general. So that's a serious weakness. That there are just a lot of maps you just genuinely cannot use him on. And also his morale is terrible, which that's not for him since he's not a frontliner. His terrible morale might actually be somewhat of a strength because if he's in a dangerous zone, his morale, if he gets hit, his morale will probably prompt him to move out of there. So that's not even necessarily a bad thing, honestly. The lack of a ranged attack is huge, as well as just his awful damage, his base damage of 3. So his damage is so extremely low, the worst base damage of any hero, and he can't attack from a range. So there's only one or two times in battle you'd probably actually have him attack an opponent, and it's so like he can't really defend himself. And even though he can do burst damage. I feel like it's kind of fiddly, where there'll be times when you use it and he'll just still kind of roll low on damage. And it's like this is his one big moment, and he ended up doing like 4 damage or 5 damage, and it's like, wow, that wasn't really worth it. Would have been better to just keep him in the back. And also his upgrades are very expensive, 125 total, not that far behind Lurtz's 135. However, I will say that Wormtongue, I would say pretty much all his upgrades, other than the Black Amulet upgrade, which increases his spear points. Pretty much all his upgrades are very optional Because if you're using him, I think the main reason you're using Wormtongue is for leadership points. And none of his upgrades or held items interact with that. So even though his upgrades are very high, I will say that most of the time that's not really that big of a deal. Just because you don't really need those upgrades for him to do his primary purpose. So moving on to the ranking, starting with Grishnakh. After everything I said about him, he's I think he is B tier. I think that is how I would put Grishnakh. He's an interesting guy. He has the potential to cause a decent amount of fear, do quite a decent amount of damage. He has a really good flank effect. However, he just doesn't have the spirit points to pull it off, and his leadership and bulk are kind of average. So I'd say his B. He's mainly carried by his skill, take cover, because that's just such a valuable skill. But it's really limited by his spirit points, and he's ends up being a roughly average fighter. So I'd say he's B tier. Lurtz is very expensive to really reach his potential, which is a limitation. However, Lurtz is just he's a very solid fighter. He's kind of an average leader, but he does he's a great archer. He has a lot of potential. I will say that I don't think Lurtz well Lurtz is a good fighter. Combined with Lurtz's high spirit points, I think he edges out Grishnakh because Lurtz, even if he's not doing anything crazy with his own skills, he can support other heroes or especially your leaders to use their skills, such as using the Intimidate skill to buff your leadership points or the On Your Feet skill to heal. So I'd say Lurtz ends up being a very good combatant who can also kind of support the other heroes and leaders in using their skills, and that's valuable. So I'd say Lurtz ends up being B tier. Ugluk, I want to put him in an S tier, but I will say his terrible leadership uh, kicks him down a notch. However, he's just so valuable, especially if you compare him with like the Mouth of Sauron, who has very good spirit points. Ugluk can just regenerate so much health for himself, so much health for the party with his On Your Feet ability, and he is such a beast in combat. He has so much hit points. He does so much damage. He is, and his spirit points are excellent. He really only has one weakness, and that's just his terrible leadership. Which, if you pair him with the right leader or hero, he can make up for it. So I think Ugluk is A tier. I think he's one of the few heroes where you can base a run around him because he's so valuable. So Gothmog, he's kind of an interesting one. My synopsis was basically he has the potential to be quite good. You know, a decent frontliner and a really good leader. But I think it takes so much investment for him to really reach that. And even then, he's held back by his bad hit points and his average morale. So I think Gothmog is C tier. If it wasn't an Iron Man, if it was more of a do a lot of grinding and then go through the game, Gothmog would be higher, but he just takes so much investment. And for a long time, he's just not that special, other than being a pretty good leader. So Gorbag, he's kind of the opposite. Doesn't take that much investment, ends up being a very solid striker, but it's just really limited in his hit points. Because if someone's a really good striker, it's okay if they're pretty mediocre in every other way, but he doesn't have the bulk to stay in the front lines. So I'd say he's high C tier. Like I said, I don't think he's someone you invest a lot into. I think he's someone you drop in late in the game if you need a hero, and I think that's something he can do. You just have to be you with his low potential, just his low ceiling for potential, and his low hit points. I would say that definitely Gorbag is someone who you don't invest him in early. You drop him in when you need to. So moving on to Sharku. Sharku is a very solid. I'd say he's very solid. Uh, he's not he's not a great fighter. He's not a great leader. He is kind of average on a lot of fronts. However, his skill, strength, and Mordor is just really helpful for just maneuver, kind of like controlling the battlefield. There's like a super dangerous opponent like Aragorn. Sharku can very cheaply shut him down for a turn with his huge. And also just being a mounted archer is really valuable. Being able to move in, attack from a distance, causing the enemy to flee and move out. So, sorry, I'm re-summarizing, but yeah, Sharku, even though he on paper is in many ways kind of average, I think he's ends up being really valuable, and I think Sharku is actually quite good. I suspect he's underrated. I really don't really guess. I guess I don't really have a standard to make a comparison for. But I think Sharku is quietly good. He's not flashy, but I think he's quietly good. So Wormtongue, he's an interesting one. I think I summed it up pretty accurately when I said on some maps he's S tier because he can just stay in the back and provide tons of leadership points without requiring any investment, which you can't say about Gothmog. There are some maps where Wormtongue is straight up S tier. However, there are a lot of maps where you just can't use Wormtongue because Legolas is on the field. Legolas is going to snipe him down, or it's just there's not enough room for Wormtongue to really hide. Or actually, if you're up against Aragorn a lot, Aragorn has the Curse of the Dead skill, which causes the whole flank to take damage, or not the whole flank, but a certain number. And no matter where you hide with him, if he's in the same flank, he's going to get hit. And he only has 9 hit points, so he won't last that long. So Wormtongue, I don't think you can really invest in Wormtongue. I think on the right levels, when you can get away with it, or if you just need a filler hero to bring leadership points, you bring in Wormtongue. So it's kind of a tough one. On a lot of levels, he's F tier, and on a lot of levels, he's C tier. I'm going to say he is solidly. No, I'm going to say he's D tier, just because you can't rely on him. Once in a while, just sometimes he's excellent, but you just can't invest in him. So yeah, I'd say he's D tier. It's definitely a tough one. That might be my most controversial pick, I'd have to say. So anyway, this is my ranking for the evil heroes. Comment below if you have any thoughts on these. Maybe some hero combinations you like. Just any thoughts you have in general. Thank you for watching. I appreciate the support, and have a good one. Goodbye.